Hey guys, number one Marmaduke fan here. I just read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, the manga adaptation by Osamu Tezuka. So first I'm going to give you like the spoiler-free like TLDR review, and then I'll dig into it because I want to talk a little bit about the book Crime and Punishment, and I want to talk about Osamu Tezuka and how he does manga adaptations. So the TLDR is, should you get Osamu Tezuka's Crime and Punishment? Well, I'm going to give it a qualified recommendation. If you love Osamu Tezuka, like me, well, of course you should get it, because Osamu Tezuka is like this legend of the manga industry. He's so super cool. He had like this big impact, lasting impact on comics. Of course you should get it. Now, if you're not the biggest Osamu Tezuka guy, should you get it? If you're a Crime and Punishment fan, I don't know if it's going to be your bag, because basically what Osamu Tezuka is doing is he thinks, I want to make take a classic novel and I want to adapt it for little children. And I want even like 8-year-olds to understand my manga. Now, can you take something like Crime and Punishment and dumb it down for 8-year-olds? I don't think you can. So Osamu Tezuka has to pull out like big chunks of stuff that I think are really important to the original novel Crime and Punishment. At the same time, I really kind of respect Osamu Tezuka just for having like the gumption to try this. Like, let's take a really dense, complex novel about an axe murderer and the psychology of that, and let's introduce it to elementary school kids, basically, and they're prostitutes. So this is rated M for mature. Really, it doesn't have anything that's too there's not really nothing explicit in it. The murder is implied. Sonia is implied to be a prostitute, but he doesn't show anything that's X-rated. So I guess my qualified recommendation is, if you're not a Tetsuka guy, this is mostly for maybe parents who want to try to introduce a young reader to the idea of Crime and Punishment. Like maybe you have like a precocious reader who you're ready to give them some like really hard books just to test them, but you're not quite sure they're ready for Crime and Punishment, so you give them this comic as a little test. Now, because I love Osamu Tezuka, I actually kind of like would recommend this to Crime and Punishment fans who don't know that much about comics, because I think it's a good illustration of Osamu Tezuka's weird mind and his ambition. Like, it took a lot of guts to try to tackle something as big and complex as Crime and Punishment. And even though it does hack out big chunks of important stuff, I'm kind of surprised by just how much attention Osamu Tezuka clearly paid to the original novel while making his adaptation. It's really striking how he's picking up on certain details from the novel, and since his problem is, how do I explain this to an 8-year-old? He has to put this complex idea into a simple little cartoon picture. So with that in mind, let's flip through it and I'll show you my highlights. So let me say something about Crime. Now that I've talked about the manga, and that's my TLDR review, let me say something about the book, Crime and Punishment. So when I was in high school, I had to like write book reports on, the great classics of literature. And a lot of the times, I'd sit and I'd read them, and probably about 90% of it would go straight over my head. And I think Crime and Punishment was one of those where I kind of like, I got he was an axe murderer, but I don't think I understood anything about the Russian politics. Then later, as an adult, I kind of remembered Crime and Punishment because a lot of guys I listened to were talking about it. Jordan Peterson famously has done lectures on Crime and Punishment. I think it's Jordan Peterson's famous novel. If you know Jordan Peterson and you read Crime and Punishment, it's sort of like you see the connection, you see why Jordan Peterson would resonate with it, because there's all this great stuff about the internal mind and struggling with yourself, about telling the truth and doing what's right. Andrew Clavin has talked about Crime and Punishment, and he said it's the greatest Christian novel of all time, and the greatest Christian novel of all time is about an axe murderer who falls in love with a prostitute, where Clavin's point is that crappy Christian art often has like a lot of happy, slappy people. Hooray, we love Jesus. But then when you get into a book that actually delves into human sin, and Dostoevsky is a very committed Christian who's wrestling with atheism and the evil in the world, you have to talk about evil in the world, and evil is evil. You can't put a G rating on evil. So one of the things that did strike me about the novel, even when I was a kid, was this guy, Raskolnikov, is in his own head thinking about murder. So if you made a movie out of it, it would just be like a guy walking down the street looking mad. I'll actually flip ahead and show you the page. So it just looked like, oh, well, here's a guy walking down the street looking mad. But in the novel, we're in his mind and he's thinking about something, and he's actually kind of like terrified at the idea of it. And at first you're thinking, well, what's this guy's deal? What's he thinking about? He doesn't want to say what it is. And if you're maybe like a more mature reader, you might be able to put two and two together, or else you have to like go ahead and see what he's thinking about and then come back and see it. What you finally figured out is he is contemplating murder, and he knows murder is wrong, and he's actually horrified with himself at the very idea that he's contemplating murder. At the same time, he's making this intellectual argument for why it would be such a good idea to commit this murder. He's an intellectual. He's a very bright young man who is using all of his powers of mind to debate himself either into or out of murdering someone. Now, one of the important plot points in the book that gets left out of the manga is he almost breaks free. He almost gets a job. He almost finds a way out of poverty that doesn't involve murdering someone, but he hears a little detail that the old lady's sister is going to be out of town, and sort of like realizing that he has an opportunity to kill her is what pushes him over the edge, and he finally commits to doing it. Tetsuka leaves out that whole plot element, and he actually leaves out the sister getting killed, right? So these are really important details of the book where if you leave them out, you're kind of missing big chunks of the book that I think are really important. But let's look at how Tetsuka simplifies this. Maybe he was required to simplify this for his editor, but one of the things that Tetsuka does is he shows panel after panel of Raskolnikov just walking and thinking. And he shows the thought bubble, and he shows a picture of what is going on in Raskolnikov's mind. So what's obviously standing out to Tetsuka is all of this narration is taking place inside of Raskolnikov's mind. So he actually has to draw a picture of him walking down and show what he's thinking. This is kind of brilliant because it's sort of like in a simplified comic format. He realizes that it's really important that this is taking place inside of Raskolnikov's mind. So that's what's kind of weirding me out about how cool this is a 6-year-old could get this, right? In the book, it's really complex and really dense and really makes you think. But Tetsuka sort of spots the really important idea of this scene, and he relates that visually. Jumping ahead, here's another example of something from the book that clearly just stood out to Tetsuka. So it's got some silly Billy, slapstick comedy because he wants to entertain the little kid who's reading this. At the same time, he's he's trying to like convey the point to them at a 6-year-old level. One of the things Raskolnikov does is because he's so smart, he observes a lot of detail. So he thinks about the number of steps up to the 3rd floor where he wants to kill the pawn shop lady. So Tetsuka shows you kind of like the architecture of the rundown apartments. So you understand like the situation. Like he's got to sneak past these guys, get up to the 3rd floor. Like that's a lot of complex stuff. But again, by laying it out visually, a kid wouldn't have to sort of sit there and struggle with it and try to picture it all in their mind. Tetsuka's helping the little kid understand what the heck is going on. It also kind of like makes for this neat economy where it just gets you into this nice little pattern. And again, it's Tetsuka doing something that's comic specific. So sort of because Tetsuka works so hard and produced, like I think even super Tetsuka fans probably haven't read 10% of what the massive, gigantic stack of books that Tetsuka produced over its lifetime. It's sort of like because Tetsuka devoted his entire life just to making comics, even when he cranks out a comic in his spare time for fun, he's doing things with comics that are really unique and really interesting. Like this doesn't work in movies. You couldn't have like a single shot that's vertical in a movie because that just wouldn't work. But in a comic page format, it really works in this context. And it just gets us into this nice pattern where we perfectly understand the layout of the room and what he's got to do to try to murder this lady and get away with it. This is another example of a thing that is hard to get unless you're a mature reader who like can pay attention to details and sort of in your mind create a picture of what Dostoevsky is talking about. the way Tetsuka is helping the young reader is he's making the picture for them, so they understand that without having to construct it all in their mind. So, flashing forward to what's the judge's name? All of these Russian names are getting me. Judge Porfiry. So Judge Porfiry suspects Raskolnikov because he reads his article that's basically a prediction of sort of Nietzsche's Übermensch. Raskolnikov thinks that there are extraordinary people who are above the law. Now, again, Tetsuka is departing from Dostoevsky's intentions to explain it to a kid. So Dostoevsky's writing in the early 1900s. Tetsuka alludes to Hitler. That's an anachronism. Hitler isn't mentioned in Crime and Punishment. Crime and Punishment was written decades before Hitler. But basically, Tetsuka thinks, well, kids aren't going to know much about the Russian czars, but little kids know who Napoleon is. Little kids know who Hitler and Stalin are. So I'll use Napoleon and Hitler and Stalin as a way of explaining great man theory, basically. So again, it's departing from the book, but I kind of respect it because I get what Tetsuka is doing. Tetsuka wants a little kid to get this really important philosophical point that the entire novel hinges on. Now, I fast forwarded to this because this is just a good example of Tetsuka being weird, and I kind of like that Tetsuka is weird. So in the midst of this intense interrogation sequence where Raskolnikov figures out that the police are onto him, and he actually kind of like brazenly admits to, well, if I were the murderer, here's how I'd do it, as a way of maybe trying to like bluff his way out of this. Then this little guy with a giant nose comes up and sneezes on him, and his giant nose starts just like, this is just so weird. I don't quite get it. I don't quite get Tetsuka's sense of humor, but I did laugh because after this really intense interrogation sequence, it's sort of like Tetsuka thinks, okay, I need to do something to lighten the mood or crack up the little kids who are reading this so they stay engaged. It's the contrast between the silliness of this and the seriousness of this. Something about it just works for me. So maybe it wouldn't work for you. It's just a good illustration of how Tetsuka is kind of weird in his adaptation. Here's another example. So Marmeladov. And again, Tetsuka has all these jokes about how his name sounds like marmalade. Ha, ha, ha. Isn't that funny, kids? So Marmeladov is like a really hard character because he sort of parallels Raskolnikov, where both of them do something wrong, even though they both know it's wrong. Raskolnikov knows murder is wrong, but he convinces himself that it's a good idea to murder this woman. Marmeladov drinks and is an alcoholic, and he knows that's wrong, and he knows he's hurting his family because of that. But because he hates himself, and because he wants to punish himself, he drinks more to hurt himself. At the same time, he knows it's wrong and it's hurting his family. So it's like this cycle. He drinks, that makes his family's life miserable. He hates himself for making his family's life miserable. So he drinks more to hurt himself as punishment. It's horrible. It's just gut-wrenchingly terrifying. So how is Tetsuka going to explain this to a kid? Well, his way is basically just to flat out have the character say, I think that man is tormenting himself. So really complex, really difficult idea for a child. His way of explaining it is just to be very straightforward and kind of like have a character point out the big point of Marmeladov's character. Jumping forward to this. So this is a good example of Tetsuka doing interesting stuff comics-wise. So Raskolnikov goes to talk to Sonia, and what's clear is that Sonia, even though she's a prostitute, has this faith in God that's very simple. It's sort of like she's a very simple Christian girl who just has this faith and has this hope that God will protect them even as she's selling her body, knowing that it's wrong. Whereas Raskolnikov has had to convince himself there is no God in his own mind to justify murdering people and to justify the idea that he is this great intellectual man who's above everybody, right? So Tetsuka knows this is a really important scene. So he needs to kind of signal to the reader that something important is about to happen. So he takes about a page of little establishing shots to set the mood. You know, rain falling, Raskolnikov alone in the rain, a little cartoon mouse running away in the rain as it falls down in pellets, right? So just a little thing to signal you that something is important is coming. They have their dialogue about God, and Tetsuka, again, he knows this is important, so he's got to do something other than just like two characters looking at each other, yelling at each other to underscore this. So he has like a droplet of water drip down, and Sonia's face is reflected in it, and then as the drop of water drips away, her face is still reflected in it, but it's sort of like it's distorted. Now, I don't know what, I don't see any like special significance to this other than maybe Tetsuka thought it looked cool and it was a way of maybe underscoring what Sonia is saying. Maybe he's saying that something about Sonia's worldview is changing Raskolnikov, but again, from a comics writing perspective, what's interesting about this is Tetsuka needs to make it interesting to the kids. And when there's a moral problem between the characters, he needs to use something in the visuals that breaks the normal monotony. So if a lot of it is just kind of like really straightforward panels, really, really simple compositions, and even kind of like cartoony slapstick comedy, when he gets to something important, he changes the style of the art dramatically in a way that stands out to you. And he chooses an important scene to do that, where it's kind of like this is a hinge moment for Raskolnikov's moral character. Now, he does it again here. Raskolnikov goes and he meets the judge, and the judge tells him, well, I know you did it, but I don't have the evidence to convict you yet. I think you're going to turn yourself in because it's a criminal is like a moth attracted to the flame. The moth knows it's going to kill it, but it can't resist the temptation of the flame. Another really complex idea. So Tetsuka, again, needs to explain it in pictures without words. So there's this really striking sequence where he abandons dialogue entirely and he lets the words do the talking. So the little cute cartoon moth girl sees the flame and runs away. And then the flame kind of beckons to her, and the moth knows it's going to kill it. The flame is going to kill it. But finally the moth is overcome by temptation and runs to the flame and is consumed. And then the flame transforms into the judge, and then it returns back to a normal scene. It's this really striking sequence where Tetsuka wants to use the death of the moth and this strong visual idea to explain something that probably isn't going to make sense to a kid. Like, why would a criminal turn himself in? He got away with it, didn't he? So it's brilliant. I kind of respect how Tetsuka realizes this is a problem. This is something really complex. You could probably use like a page of inner dialogue to try to explain this to a kid, or you could use these really simple pictures to kind of get the idea in their heads. It's sort of like he's simplifying the idea so much that it no longer has anything to do with the novel, but somehow because he really pays attention to the novel he's reading, he's able to, I don't know, latch on to things that are important anyway. Of course, it ends with Raskolnikov basically confessing his love and his crime to Sonia, and Sonia's simple sort of Christian perspective is, well, how could you do that? It's like you're possessed by a demon. You need to confess your sin. Now it ends with Raskolnikov screaming his guilt in the middle of the street and walking off, and that's how it ends. Just boom. Now, if you're a kid again, and you kind of think, well, wait, isn't the inspector gonna come and put him in jail? That's the woomph. That's where it leaves you. You don't see him getting arrested. You don't see him getting put in jail or executed. Tetsuka just wants to leave you with the confession as the great big moment that everything led up to. So, what's my final thoughts? It's a weird comic. It's not as good as reading the original novel, but I think we need to do more to introduce classic literature both to young readers and to people who maybe struggle with reading, or they try to read and they just don't get the point of it. I think a lot of teachers maybe just tell students to read books and assign it, and they don't help them understand it at all. So basically, if you're not really paying attention, what happened to me when I was in high school was I struggled with the Russian names, and I had trouble keeping straight who was who in high school. So basically, all I got out of it is this guy committed a murder and he got caught, right? Like Bart Simpson book reported it. But I think the advantage of something like Tetsuka is because he's concerned about explaining it to a 6-year-old, it might give you kind of like a good little placeholder where you say, okay, there's this guy, there's this guy, there's this guy, there's this guy. There you go. So I actually kind of want to read the afterword because Tetsuka has an interesting way of expressing himself and what his goals were. Back during the 32nd and 33rd year of the Showa period, 1957 to 1958, adapting world-renowned classic literature into manga was a bit of a trend. Among all the adaptations made during this period of bandwagon hopping, the most well-known adaptations were part of a collected manga series put out by a certain publisher. Well-known masterpieces such as A Little Princess, Treasure Island, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and The Three Musketeers were all adapted into various manga editions through the hands of both rookie and veteran children's manga artists, and they sold especially well. They had a wide target audience, including mothers concerned with their children's education. Since they were marketed as masterpieces, they thought these manga must be of great quality, and so they were willing to purchase them for their children. However, due to some issues with the storyline management and the technical difficulties of editing, the manga artists were prone to churning out low-cost productions. As a result, it is difficult to find any highly acclaimed works. However, as for Crime and Punishment, it was a story I drew and edited while I was still in Osaka, which was 4 years before the trend began, and thus unrelated to it. In fact, way back in the 24th year of the Showa period, 1949, I had already adapted Faust into a manga. So strictly speaking, Crime and Punishment is my second work to adapt a piece of world-renowned classic literature. I was hoping very much to introduce the literature I had read in my youth to the children of that time, which is the reason I decided to draw them. Of course, instead of such works as Treasure Island or Jack and the Beanstalk, I wanted to choose something which was not already well known, but rather literature that children don't usually get exposed to, or even adults for that matter. So, after much consideration, the first completed work was Faust. Thanks to the reputation of Faust itself, my manga version sold pretty well. Following this success, I started work on an adaptation of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. However, due to the sudden increase in my workload from serializations in magazines, I didn't have much time to rearrange everything, so it took an entire year to complete. A portion of the manuscript was even done while riding the train between Osaka and Tokyo, the scene where Luzin and Raskolnikov meet at the restaurant. However, even though the publisher put in a lot of effort, the sales weren't as good as expected. I guess the reason for that could be because the story was too plain and the theme was just too deep to understand. I actually received more encouragement and praise from students and adult readers than I ever had. Now that I look back at this work, I think it was a bit of a disaster, but at the same time, adapting Crime and Punishment seemed like a risk without any guarantees. So perhaps the encouragement from my readers was in praise of my courage for trying. Crime and Punishment, published November 5th, 1953, by Tokodo. So let's get back to Tetsuka. So the reason I love Tetsuka is he was kind of an insane genius who he loved comics. He loved making comics. He spent his whole life making comics. He died young, having worked on comics at an insane rate all his life. And it's sort of like he's even aware that choosing Crime and Punishment as a novel to adapt for little elementary school readers, that's a weird thing to pick, but it's sort of like he had balls for trying, and he kind of knew that he wanted the kids to kind of get the woomph of the novel, even if they were maybe a little too young to understand it. So again, this is a qualified recommendation. It's a drastic hypersimplification of Crime and Punishment, but I really respect the effort. I think it could have usefulness for a little kid or for someone who's maybe like trying to read the novel and they're struggling with it. What's with all these Russian names? I don't understand. From a comics perspective, I really just respect Tetsuka. Full stop, period. Like the thing I respect most about Tetsuka is even though he had kind of like the style where he would struggle sometimes with drawing some things, he changed the entire manga industry and the entire comics industry. You cannot read a comic book or you can't just read a manga. You can't read a comic book today that doesn't have like the stamp of Tetsuka's influence on the comics media on it. So from that perspective, definitely Tetsuka is worth reading, and this is a really good one to read because it's not Tetsuka writing like silly little children's stories. It's Tetsuka trying to mix silly little children's stories with like a really deep, really important classic novel in Russian literature. So there you go. 25 minutes. That's enough. No more. I've bloviated enough about this. I'm number one Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.